Imagine this. It's late, maybe 2 a.m., and suddenly news breaks. Or maybe not even news, just online chatter. That a major website, like a big news outlet or a travel company you use all the time, has been, well, changed.
Defaced, yeah. The homepage is totally different. Maybe there's a message. It's jarring.
Exactly. It's immediate, it's disruptive, you know something big happened, but then the fog rolls in.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Who did it? Why? And crucially, what's the real story? Because you start getting all these different versions.
Precisely. And that whole dynamic, the incident, the official story, the counter stories, that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at a series of cyber incidents in Uruguay that really grabbed headlines.
Right, we're talking major media sites like El País Uruguay and big companies, Buquebus Turismo, for instance, getting defaced. And it all led to the arrest of a young hacker.
Which then sparked this huge public debate, didn't it? About justice, media honesty, cyber stuff.
Yeah, it touched a lot of nerves. And for this deep dive, we've got some really interesting source material. We're looking at direct transcripts, communications from people right in the thick of it.
We'll hear from a hacker known as Gob Ethereum, who actually claimed responsibility for some of these things, and also from Alberto Daniel Hill. He's a social media personality, kind of an investigator.
And he really made it his mission to get these alternative accounts out there, didn't he? To challenge the mainstream narrative.
That's our core mission today. To unpack these firsthand stories, we're especially interested in Alberto's approach, how he tried to bypass traditional media to inform the public directly.
And how that direct info was received,
Yes.
or maybe more accurately, how it wasn't received by the big news outlets.
Exactly. We'll explore that huge gap between the story the hackers were telling and the story most people read in the news. It tells you so much about how information flows or doesn't flow these days.
Okay, let's get into it. How did these stories start diverging so dramatically?
So let's start at the beginning. The incidents themselves. We mentioned Gob Ethereum claiming responsibility. What was he saying about why he did it? What was the motivation?
It's interesting. It was kind of a mix. He actually said one time it was just boredom. Like late at night thinking, maybe I'll hack a page before bed.
Seriously, just boredom.
Well, that was maybe part of it, or how he initially framed one instance. But there was a much stronger, more consistent theme, too. He kept talking about justice for Vlad and freedom for our comrade.
Okay, so Vlad is presumably the young hacker who got arrested later.
Seems very likely, yes. So it wasn't just random digital graffiti. There was this element of solidarity, maybe protest, trying to support someone he felt was wronged.
That changes the frame quite a bit, doesn't it? From just mischief to something more like, well, he called it hacktivism.
Right, and the first big one we should probably detail is the El País Uruguay defacement. That wasn't minor, right? Around 2 a.m.?
No, not at all. And Gob was pretty specific. He said he compromised their CMS panel. For people listening, what does getting into a major news site's CMS actually let you do?
Oh, it's basically getting the keys to the kingdom for their online presence. The CMS content management system, that's where they write articles, upload them, manage sections, control the homepage, everything.
So he could stop news from being published, change stories, put his own message front and center.
Pretty much all of the above. You control the CMS, you control the narrative output of that site. And Gob seemed to understand that. He mentioned wanting likes, reposts, visualizations. He wanted people to see what he'd done and the message behind it.
Okay, so that was El País. Then there was Buquebus Turismo, the travel company. Gob said he was one of 3 people involved in that one. But how they got in? That was different, right? Not some super complex hack.
That's a really key point he made. He said they used something called Intellex, or Intelligence X, which is basically a known tool, an OSINT tool.
OSINT, open source intelligence, using publicly available information.
Exactly. So they found leaked credentials, maybe from an old data breach somewhere else entirely, or malware, and used those to log into an administration panel.
So they didn't, break down the digital door.
He emphasized that. He said they basically used keys that were already lying around in public data dumps. They walked in, they didn't break in. That's why he argued a defacement is not a crime in that context.
Arguing it's more about exposing negligence than committing a new crime.
Yeah, it was his framing, yeah. More of a demonstration of existing weakness.
Okay, so that's Gob's version of how they did it. But then things really shifted when the authorities got involved, and particularly with the arrest of this 18-year-old Vladdy.
Right. Vladdy's arrest was a huge turning point. And the question Gob raised was, why him specifically? Gob's explanation was that Vladdy was already known and had been doxxed.
Dox meaning his personal info name, maybe address, was already out there online.
Correct. Which Unfortunately, it makes an easier target for authorities. Maybe someone tipped them off, maybe an undercover online, who knows. But it meant he was visible.
And once he was arrested, the official narrative really ramped up, didn't it? The charges listed were extensive, far beyond just defacing a couple of websites.
Oh yeah, suddenly Vladdy, and by extension Gob, were being linked to all sorts of things. Alleged hacks of government bodies, Denasia, MIDES, the Ministry of Public Health.
Plus, private companies like Bukeba's, Las Piedras Shopping, it sounded like this massive cybercrime spree.
Exactly. But Gob, very quickly and publicly, pushed back hard against those broader accusations.
What did he deny specifically?
He flat out denied hacking MIDES or Denaso. He denied publishing, filtering, or selling any data, which is usually where the more serious charges come in. And he explicitly said they weren't affiliated with groups like Pampa Leaks, who are known for big data breaches in Argentina.
So he was trying to draw a clear line. We did this defacements, but we didn't do that. Major government breaches, data selling.
Precisely. He was trying to narrow the scope of what they were actually responsible for.
But what about the data vulnerability thing? The government seemed to make a big deal about Vladdy's Telegram bot being his main crime. How did Gob explain that if he denied stealing data?
Okay, this is where it gets technical, but it's important.
Yeah.
Gob insisted the bot didn't steal data directly from government servers like RENAPER, the National Registry.
Okay, so where did the data come from?
He said it used publicly filtered credentials, maybe from data breaches like Info Experto in Argentina. So it was OSINT again. You put in, say, a DNI number, and if that info was already floating around in leaked databases the bot had access to, it might display it.
Ah, so the bot was searching existing leaked data, not actively breaching government systems to get new data.
That was Gob's crucial distinction. He compared it to just using a public search tool for info that was already compromised, not the source of the breach itself, which, in his view, makes it a very different kind of offense, if any.
And the really big government system hacks, like RENAPER or Mi Argentina, if not his group, who did he say did those?
He pointed fingers elsewhere. He mentioned a group he called the Gentile Mafia, said their leader was even in prison. He claimed any messages his group sent about those systems were just sarcasm.
Sarcastic commentary on how vulnerable the government was, not a claim of responsibility.
That's what he maintained. Digital potshots, not actual confessions to those major breaches. He did, however, take responsibility for hacking some artist accounts back in 2022. Sarah Melicara, Orslok, Coquille, Montana.
Okay, but he framed those differently.
Yeah, you presented those as sort of separate personal things, almost like digital pranks, not part of the main hacktivism or anything related to the government charges. It's all about how he defined his own actions versus what the official narrative was saying.
Okay, so you've got this massive gap opening up. Gov and his associates saying one thing, the official charges and media reports painting a much broader, more sinister picture. And that's where Alberto Daniel Hill comes charging in, right? Driven by frustration with the media.
Absolutely. Alberto was watching this unfold and getting increasingly, let's say, agitated with how the traditional media was covering it, or rather not covering it.
What was his main beef with them?
His core criticism was that they didn't give a minute, his words, to Gob's side of the story. Even when Gob was putting explanations out there publicly, the major outlets just seemed to ignore it.
He saw it as deliberate, not just missing the story.
It seemed so. He felt they were consciously choosing to stick with the official narrative, the one that was easier or maybe served some other purpose, rather than engaging with information that complicated things.
And he wasn't quiet about it. He called them out for focusing on garbage, didn't he?
He did. He was really critical that instead of digging into the actual legal situation or the security flaws Gob was pointing out, the media was getting sidetracked by, who Gob knew or what his life was like. Irrelevant stuff, in Alberto's view.
He basically asked why they weren't criticizing their own reporting instead of criticizing him for just platforming Gob's voice.
Exactly. He saw himself as just opening a channel for direct information, and he felt the media was attacking the messenger instead of engaging with the message or examining their own coverage. It's a pretty sharp critique of journalistic priorities.
And a big part of his frustration tied into the legal process itself, especially for Vladdy. The lack of transparency there.
That was huge for Alberto. The fact that there wasn't a clear expediente, the official case file with all the evidence, he found that appalling. He said it made a proper defense almost impossible.
He even related to his own past experiences, right? Not knowing the details of charges against him.
Yeah, he mentioned not fully understanding what he was accused of until after he was released in a previous situation. His point was stark. How can you defend yourself if the evidence, the specific accusations are kept under wraps? It just completely undermines basic fairness.
So all this frustration led him to take matters into his own hands, using digital tools to bypass the media gatekeepers.
Right. His main tool was Twitter Spaces, the live audio feature. He used it to let Gob speak directly, unedited, unfiltered, no media spin.
And he didn't just host the spaces, he actively tried to make sure the press saw it.
Oh, yeah. He was amplifying Dobbs' audios, sharing screenshots, saving videos on places like the Wayback Machine to create a public record. And he explicitly said he was tagging journalists, copying press members into the spaces. He basically dared them to listen.
A very direct challenge. And he even offered that controversial reframing, suggesting the defacements were actually a good thing for the companies, like free security testing.
Yeah, the free pen testing argument. It's definitely provocative. His point was, look, these guys showed you where you were vulnerable. You should thank them, fix the hole, not hunt them down.
Because otherwise, maybe someone genuinely malicious could have used that same vulnerability later.
That was the implication, that they were performing a sort of unintentional public service by exposing weaknesses before bad actors did. It completely flips the victim-perpetrator narrative.
Interesting take. Now, tied into all this, both God and Alberto kept pointing out what they saw as major flaws in the legal system dealing with this stuff. Jurisdiction was one big issue.
Yeah, the whole cross-border nature of the internet makes jurisdiction really messy. Their argument was, okay, if Bukebis' website is hosted on Cloudflare servers in, say, Canada or the US, not physically in Uruguay or Argentina.
But does Uruguayan law even fully apply? Or should it be handled differently?
Exactly. It complicates things immensely. Which country's laws govern an action that happens on a server located elsewhere? They were suggesting the arrests in Uruguay might have been legally shaky on those grounds, potentially an overreach of jurisdiction.
And they also strongly disagreed with the type of charges filed against Vladdy, things like aggravated data violation. They felt that was completely misrepresenting what actually happened.
Right. They kept insisting the actions were either using publicly available info or just website defacements, not deep data theft, not illegal interception in the way the charges implied.
So they saw it as the legal system using sledgehammer charges for actions that, in their view, warranted much less severe consequences or maybe different charges altogether.
That's the core of it. A mismatch between the alleged actions and the severity and even the definition of the crimes Vladdy was charged with. They felt the legal system wasn't properly distinguishing between different kinds of online activity.
And that confidential case file, the expediente, remained a massive obstacle throughout.
Absolutely. It kept coming up. Alberto, drawing on his own past, stressed how impossible it makes things. If you and your lawyer can't see the detailed evidence against you, how do you even begin to refute it?
It just breeds suspicion and feeds into that narrative you mentioned earlier.
The scapegoat narrative, yeah. If the process isn't transparent, it's easier to believe someone's being railroaded.
And adding to that suspicion was their claim about a lack of solid forensic evidence.
They made a point of saying there wasn't, like, slam dunk forensic proof, no definitive IP address links presented publicly, no verified photo sources connecting the accused to all the wide-ranging accusations.
So they felt the government's case, at least as publicly presented or understood, was maybe built more on circumstance or assumption than hard technical proof.
That was their assertion, that it was potentially weak, maybe even partly fabricated, to secure a quick, high-profile arrest, rather than being based on meticulous, undeniable evidence for every single charge.
Which brings us back squarely to that scapegoat idea, that Vladdy, maybe Gob too, were being set up.
Yeah, that the government needed a win, needed to look like they were cracking down effectively on cybercrime, especially after these embarrassing public defacements.
So arresting someone relatively easy to find, someone already doxxed,
allows them to announce a success, project competence, maybe calm public fears. Even if, according to Gob and Alberto, it diverted attention from bigger, harder-to-catch cyber threats.
It paints the government's actions in a very cynical, PR-driven light, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It directly challenges the official story of diligent investigation leading to the capture of a major cybercriminal. Their narrative suggests something much more focused on appearances.
Okay, so Alberto goes to all this effort. Twitter Spaces, sharing evidence, tagging journalists. He's practically handing the counter-narrative to the traditional media on a silver platter. How'd they respond? You mentioned earlier, zero ball.
Yeah, that was the term used in the source material, and it seems spot on. Despite Alberto's very direct, very public efforts, the mainstream media response was overwhelmingly silence.
Nothing. They didn't report on Gob's explanations, didn't reference the audios or screenshots Alberto was sharing.
Largely, no. The accounts suggest total silence on that front. They reported the initial arrest, the official charges, but when it came to the detailed rebuttals and alternative perspective provided directly by Gob, crickets.
Wow, that's quite a contrast to how quickly they jumped on the initial accusations.
It really is. It strongly suggests a lack of interest, or maybe a deliberate choice, not to engage with information that challenged the simpler official story.
And when they did engage, it sounds like it wasn't really with the substance of the claims, more like shifting to attacks or labels. Gob mentioned being called a Nazi after an interview.
Right, that incident is telling. Instead of discussing the technical points, the legal arguments, or the security issues he raised, the focus shifted to this highly inflammatory, polarizing label.
Which effectively dismisses the person and everything they say, right? Sidesteps the actual issues.
It's a classic tactic, unfortunately. If you can discredit the source with a powerful negative label, you don't have to grapple with their arguments. It allowed the media, or parts of the public discourse anyway, to avoid the more complex and potentially uncomfortable questions about the case and their own reporting.
Did anyone in the media seem to be paying attention, even if their outlets weren't reporting it? Alberto tagged them directly.
There were small signs. Alberto did note that some individuals, journalists from El País, for example, started following him on social media around that time.
So they were aware. Curious, maybe.
Possibly aware, yes. But, and this is the key thing, that individual awareness didn't translate into institutional reporting. Their news outlets still didn't cover Gob's side of the story. So whatever personal interest there might have been, it didn't seem to influence the editorial decisions.
And Gob had his own frustrating experience with the direct media interview, didn't he, of Montevideo Portal?
Yeah, he talked about that. He said he spent considerable time answering like 25 detailed questions for them. But then the article took ages to come out, and when it did, it apparently had errors.
What kind of errors?
Crucially, he said it incorrectly compared him or mixed him up with another known hacker, Santiago Rosenblatt, which is a pretty fundamental error, blurring his identity and specific actions with someone else's.
That would definitely fuel his perception that they weren't taking him or the details seriously.
Exactly. It reinforced his view that the media wasn't really interested in accuracy or his specific perspective, maybe just a quick story that fit a pre-existing mold.
Yeah.
Lack of respect for his time, lack of accuracy. It all fed into his distrust.
Okay, so that's the media side. What about the government? Did they ever reach out to Gob, according to him? Maybe to understand the vulnerabilities he exploited?
That's another really significant point he made. Absolutely no contact. He was explicit. No government official, Uruguayan, Argentinian, anyone ever reached out to him.
Not even to ask, hey, how did you do that so we can fix it?
Apparently not.
Mm-hmm.
Which again, strongly suggests their focus wasn't on fixing the underlying security problems. It was purely on assigning blame, making the arrest stick, projecting strength. If they were genuinely interested in improving security, you'd think they'd want to understand the method of attack.
The lack of contact really bolsters Gob and Alberto's claim that the authorities were more interested in punishment than prevention.
It fits perfectly with their narrative, and it led them both to use pretty strong language, didn't it? Accusing the press and government of being liars.
Yeah, they didn't mince words. They seemed convinced that narratives were being actively fabricated, not just spun, but actually made up.
Fabricated, to make the arrests look like a bigger deal than they were, to create this illusion that the authorities were effectively tackling cybercrime, while, in their view, the real criminals
Like carding groups, the data seller.
were operating pretty much untouched. That contrast was central to their accusation of dishonesty and misdirection by both the state and the press.
And their opinion of the police and the justice system seemed pretty low overall, calling them stupid, painted, meaning useless.
Very strong language, yeah. It reflected deep frustration and a belief that the system was fundamentally broken, or at least incompetent in this area. They argued law enforcement went after the lechugas.
Small fish, easy targets.
Right. Instead of going after the sharks, the organized groups causing widespread financial harm. It paints a picture of a justice system focused on easy wins and public perception, rather than tackling the most serious threats effectively. A huge disconnect between how these hacktivists saw themselves and how the state treated them.
Okay, stepping back from the specific details of this case, what does it all tell us about the bigger picture? Things like, how do we even define hacktivism versus plain old cybercrime? And what about justice and responsibility online?
That definitional question is huge here. Gob was really insistent on this. He and his group were activists, not criminals.
How did he make that distinction? Where did he draw the line?
He drew it very clearly. Their actions, as he defined them, defacing websites to send a message, exposing vulnerabilities, were fundamentally different from malicious stuff like carding, stealing credit card info, stealing and selling personal data, or ransomware.
So intent and outcome were key for him. Their goal wasn't financial gain or causing chaos for its own sake.
Exactly. He framed their core purpose as sending a political message, pointing out that systems aren't secure, that governments maybe aren't doing enough. It was about provoking thought, exposing failures.
Not about emptying bank accounts or encrypting hospital files.
Right. A completely different category of action in his mind. They saw themselves as digital protesters or whistleblowers, not thieves.
Which then raises massive questions about government responsibility, doesn't it? If systems are that vulnerable, who's ultimately responsible?
And that's a point both Gobb and Alberto hit hard. They argued that while authorities chase hacktivists, the real monster, the large-scale organized cybercrime that causes massive damage, often seems to operate with relative impunity.
A misallocation of resources, maybe? Focusing on the noisy activists instead of the quiet, dangerous predators.
That's certainly the critique they offered, that law enforcement priorities might be skewed, perhaps focusing on easier or more visible targets, rather than the complex, resource-intensive investigations needed to take down major criminal rings.
And they went further, suggesting governments should be held accountable when data is breached, not just blame the hackers.
Yes, that's a radical but important point they made. If a government is responsible for protecting its citizens' data and fails to do so adequately, shouldn't the government itself face consequences, maybe sanctions or at least serious political heat for negligence?
Instead of the narrative always being solely about the evil hacker.
Right. It shifts the burden. It says, yes, exploiting vulnerabilities is one thing, but allowing those vulnerabilities to persist through negligence is another and perhaps equally serious failure that needs accountability. It emphasizes the defender's duty of care.
And this focus on arrests, they argued, might actually be counterproductive, creating a false sense of security.
That's the danger they highlighted. You arrest a couple of defacers, the public feels like something's been done, politicians declare victory, but does it actually make the underlying systems any more secure?
Probably not if the focus isn't on fixing the root causes.
Exactly. They argued it diverts attention and resources from the hard, unglamorous work of actually improving cybersecurity infrastructure, patching systems, investing in defense. It's potentially security theater rather than real security improvement.
And behind all these debates about policy and strategy, there's a real human cost. Vladi's situation is a prime example.
It really is. You have an 18-year-old kid held incommunicado facing serious charges, potentially without even seeing the full evidence against him, cut off from family. The psychological impact of that alone is immense.
It feels disproportionate, doesn't it? Even if you disagree with what he did.
It certainly raises questions about proportionality and whether the system was more focused on making an example of him than on, say, rehabilitation or understanding the context. It's a stark reminder of the real-world consequences.
And it sounds like Vladi's situation directly affected Gobb's own thinking and actions moving forward.
Definitely. Gobb admitted feeling persecuted, and he decided to significantly lower his profile. He mentioned Vladi's family asking him not to cause more trouble, which is completely understandable.
So seeing his friend imprisoned brought the potential consequences home in a very real way.
It seems so. He spoke about the emotional toll. Maybe the abstract idea of fighting the system became very concrete and painful when it meant seeing people he cared about incarcerated. It suggests a sobering shift in perspective.
And did this lead to any thoughts about different ways to achieve their goals, moving away from pure hacktivism?
Well, the discussion points towards that, doesn't it? Towards recognizing the limits and high costs of hacktivism alone. It suggests maybe a greater focus on legal strategies is needed.
Like working with lawyers, digital rights organizations, advocating for policy change through established channels.
Exactly. While hacking might expose a problem dramatically, creating lasting change might require sustained legal and political effort, especially given the harsh personal consequences people like Vladi faced. It's perhaps a sign of maturing tactics, or at least a painful lesson learned.
Reflecting on all this, what advice did Gob have for younger people who might be drawn to hacking? Did he express regret?
He did express regret, quite clearly, and his advice was blunt. Stay away from the illegal stuff. He explicitly said he wasn't a role model in that regard, despite some people looking up to him.
So what did he suggest instead?
He strongly recommended channeling that interest and skill into legal pathways. Get into cybersecurity professionally, work for companies, help defend systems, join associations. He stressed the huge risks of illegal activity prison ruining your future.
So it's not about crushing that curiosity, but redirecting it, recognizing the talent, but guiding it constructively.
That's a great way to put it. Hacking often stems from intense curiosity, a drive to understand systems, and internal power, as the source material put it. The argument is that society should find ways to nurture that talent ethically and legally.
Rather than just bringing down the hammer.
Right, because that talent is valuable. We need people with those skills working legally to improve security for everyone. Criminalizing the curiosity itself might be counterproductive in the long run. It's about fostering responsible innovation instead of just punishing transgression.
This whole deep dive really throws into sharp relief just how different a first-hand account can be from the official story, especially the one filtered through traditional media. The gap is just huge.
It really is. And Gob's side, amplified by Alberto, was largely met with that total silence from major news outlets. Even when evidence like audios and videos was directly offered, it suggests a real reluctance to complicate the accepted narrative.
Alberto clearly tried to force the issue, didn't he? Using Twitter Spaces, tagging journalists, basically trying to bypass the traditional gatekeepers and get the raw information straight to the public.
He did. He pushed back hard against the media focusing on what he saw as distractions, personal details about Gob instead of the core issues. The legal process, the alleged lack of evidence, the security vulnerabilities themselves.
His efforts were a direct challenge to their silence, a demand for transparency.
Yet that silence largely held. The failure to reference the direct evidence, the misrepresentations Gob complained about. It points to a significant resistance within traditional media to engage deeply with challenging alternative viewpoints.
Why do you think that is? Fear of giving a platform. Sticking to official sources, just easier.
It could be a mix of things. Maybe fear of appearing to legitimize someone accused of crimes. Maybe reliance on established relationships with official sources. Maybe it's just simply to run with the initial, less complicated narrative. But the outcome was an information vacuum for the public.
Which really puts the burden back on us, doesn't it, as information consumers?
It absolutely does. If the established channels aren't giving you the full picture, if narratives are conflicting, then the responsibility to dig deeper, to seek out multiple sources, to critically analyze what you're being told, that falls increasingly on you.
So for you listening, navigating this digital age means constantly questioning. It means understanding that the first story or the loudest story isn't always the whole story. You have to be willing to look for those other perspectives, like the ones Alberto was trying to share.
Which leads to that really provocative final thought. In a world where information flies instantly, but official stories can be slow, opaque, maybe even biased, who actually controls the truth about something like these cyber incidents?
And maybe even more importantly, what's our responsibility as citizens? Do we just accept the headlines? Or do we have a duty to push past them, to try and grasp the complex realities of cybersecurity, justice, and how information itself is shaped and contested in our world today? Something to definitely keep thinking about.